Welcome everyone on the neighbor islands as well as here on Oahu. It's an honor to welcome you today. It's our 15th annual seminar on peace, environment, human rights, and global justice. We also have dubbed it the Advanced Summer Seminar on Human Rights. We've hosted it here in Hawaii now for our 15th year. And we've had many extraordinary speakers and different events to be able to share the developments of human rights over the last decade plus 5 years. What we're going to talk about today briefly is some of the things that we've looked at with the issues as well as the amazing speakers that have been fortunate enough to come to Hawaii and share their wisdom with us. We're also going to be looking at some of the most important issues at the international institutions these days. It's quite a summer with the upcoming World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, the negotiations for the Sustainable Development Goals with the Open Working Group, as well as business and human rights at the UN Human Rights Council. We had some extraordinary steps forward with the creation of a working group for a legally binding treaty on business and human rights. That's a step beyond the guiding principles that was created by John Ruggie, and as well the working group on business and human rights, as well as the forum on business and human rights under the Human Rights Council. And then at the level of the United States, one area we've always concentrated on with our annual advanced summer seminars is actually in the United States. 2014 is a year where actually every treaty that we've ratified will actually be reviewed. We've already gone through the Civil and Political Rights Covenant at the Human Rights Committee. Next month, on August 13th, 14th, and 15th, will be reviewed by the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And in November, we'll be appearing before the UN Committee Against Torture. It's also exciting as well at the national level because right now the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities was just adopted this week at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and it's now going to a full vote in the Senate, which of course will require a 2/3 vote of 67 senators. Unfortunately, those who have been involved with the important passage of this international instrument note that it fell by 5 votes last time, so we're hoping that it moves forward even further. So these are just some of the exciting things happening with international human rights law, and we'll be able to go over those for the next hour and a half. Want to be able to first give you a little review of some of the exciting activities of what we've had at these annual advanced summer seminars on human rights. And then after we do that, we'll introduce all the participants from all the other islands. It's good to see Hilo there with the United Nations Association, as well as good to see the Human Rights Club there at West Oahu. We know we had one person at Windward who just went into birth, so we're having a human rights birth today. And we look forward to going over all these things together, as well as looking a little bit at what our plans are for the fall semester and some speakers who are already coming in. First review of the 15 years of the annual summer seminar. The first time we had this event, we actually hosted it on 3 islands. The idea was to actually start them off on Oahu and then move them to Mokokeawe on the Big Island, and then to conclude on Maui, over there where they could actually be working and being on the land at the exciting valley where still it seems as if you were there before contact, and of course still rooted in the culture and practices of the indigenous Kanaka Maoli people. At that first meeting, we actually started here on Oahu for 1 full week. We had courses at University of Hawaii at Manoa. We had many different speakers, including the late John Van Dyke. They were able to then share all the important issues of what they were looking at, as well as Noel Kent and George Kent talking about globalization, as well as the right to food and children's rights. That was amazing. But after that, though, we did move out to Mokokeawe over to the Big Island. And the Big Island was actually exciting because the Board of Regents was actually meeting to look at the telescopes. One of the important things of our summer seminars is we wanted to ensure that people would actually see human rights in action, not just theoretical, but actually learning the tools and tactics to be able to put it into practice. So we had our 25 participants from around the world see exactly what was going on with the decision around the telescopes and work closely with the communities working on right to freedom of worship and belief to make sure that this telescope issue wasn't able to go through as quickly as possible. We also had one of our speakers, the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights Secretariat, really interested to be able to see this process go through. She said it was something that she normally would have seen in one of the Latin American countries in the 70s and 80s. So it was quite shocking that way to see the vote going through the Board of Regents at that meeting. And then we concluded over on Maui, and we were able to take participants around the island to be able to see many of the beautiful spots of nature. One of the exciting things about that conference was the speakers that we did have. We have one of the foremost experts on the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. We also had the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And we also had one of the indigenous leaders from First Nations who was one of the first people to attend in 1977. But one of the exciting points as well was that all the participants were able to speak and talk directly and present their research. So we had different people from all over the world being able to share their research in the community with people on all three islands to be able to describe some of the latest research that these scholars have been doing. The second year, we actually were focusing on the role of NGOs and people power movement. We're able to have one of the foremost experts on civil society. Actually, she ended up being the coordinator for all of civil society at the World Conference Against Racism, Xenophobia. And that was an exciting conference because we focused really on how NGOs can be better informed, better involved, and have a better impact on the international scene, but also to make a difference in our own communities. We also hosted the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights the year after that to be able to speak directly about how the UN Specialized Agencies programs and funds operate and organize. It was the head of the Indigenous Peoples and Minorities Unit. We're able to take that speaker to all three islands to be able to share his insight about this important instrument, but also have many community forums with Indigenous peoples around the islands to look at ways forward. One of the exciting things that we did do as well was actually when we focused on the theme of environment, actually do our summer seminar in the classroom, but also at Haleakala above the clouds, and be able to actually discuss and have the course there in the crater and also along the hike on the way down from the summit all the way to the sea. We've also had the rapporteur of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. He was able to speak and share about how the Permanent Forum operated, and even more excitingly, able to let us see here in Hawaii the first glance of the report before it was presented to the Economic and Social Council. We also had one of the first Indigenous peoples ever elected to Parliament. The main point of that annual summer seminar was looking at how parliamentarians and elected public officials can help protect and promote human rights. One of the examples of those two summer seminars was we actually looked at adopting the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and had one of our sessions at the state legislature. One other speaker we had was actually the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, looking at a model of how we could bring Indigenous people together with the state to then, more importantly, address the human wrongs of historical proportions, but then also look at ways forward. And then 10 years ago, we actually came up with this formula of making sure that we spent more time in the community, working out in Waianae to have events out there in the evening with our representative Maile Shimabukuro and showing films, and also at the North Shore with Brigham Young University, and also even this year, of course, at University of Hawaii West Oahu with talks yesterday and Tuesday. 5 years ago, we began this new process, though, of making sure we use the interactive television system so that we could still allow everyone on all the islands to keep up with the latest developments of what's happening at the United Nations, as well as at the regional mechanisms in the Inter-American, the African, the European, and recently with the ASEAN Commission on Human Rights that just took place. One exciting thing of proportions is what we started to talk about 2 years ago on business and human rights, is actually took the next big step. There'll actually be a new treaty that'll be legally binding on transnational corporations, and the working group was just established at the June session of the UN Human Rights Council. So a lot has happened in 15 years since we first created this idea of an advanced summer seminar on human rights. We've had many international speakers come to our islands and share their knowledge. We've also had many students go from these courses on to various posts around the world to focus on promotion and protection of human rights around the planet. So that was just our brief introduction. What we'll mainly be covering today, one thing I already mentioned is the just business, looking at the business and human rights at the UN. The other will be looking at the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the context of the UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples that is coming up on September 22nd and 23rd. But another area that's quite important is the Sustainable Development Goals. So we're almost near 500 days countdown to the UN Millennium Development Goals actually being completed. What's important, though, is that many people agree the UN Millennium Development Goals didn't do enough, so they're actually looking at next steps called the post-2015 development process. There's a couple of different mechanisms that we'll go through today, but the one that's had the most public participation is the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, and we'll go through that. So we'll look at those three aspects, touch briefly upon the United States, as there's a couple of exciting things happening, and then, of course, get ready for the fall semester and maybe share some dates and times that people are interested. So first, I just let everyone introduce themselves, and if there's any topic they'd like to have covered more, just let us know. So I think first we have Letitia at West Oahu. It doesn't seem like we can hear. Maybe the button's not being pushed.
Hi, Josh.
Okay, there we go. That's working. Any topics that you wanted to be covered more than others, Letitia?
Actually, off the top of my head, I'd like to hear more about what happened this summer at the Permanent Forum on the Indigenous peoples, if you can.
Okay. I'll talk about the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. Thank you, Letitia. And then going to Hilo, we have our United Nations Association chapter. I could actually say it's a good thing I actually went to the meeting this summer in Washington, D.C., and we actually launched a couple initiatives with UNA USA, and it'd be great to maybe do those as well here in Hawaii. But we're able to have universal periodic review consultations at the National Conference at the UN Foundation in DC, and have a couple smaller ones with different chapters and divisions across the country so far this summer. So maybe we can look at doing universal periodic review consultations in Hilo and Maui and Kauai, as well as all over Oahu as well. But let's hear from UNA USA Hawaii chapter.
Okay, this is Ruth Larkin. I'm the president of our chapter, and we're looking forward to all the wonderful things that are going to be happening for the coming year.
Okay.
And I'm
Perfect.
Eleanor Wolf, an old-time human rights person in Hilo. We're working on the topics for our meeting and for looking at the Millennium Goals and working for human rights.
Excellent. So I saw you already have an event on climate change, and that'll be exciting. It's a very important topic that was even addressed here at the UN regarding the Sustainable Development Goals. One of the exciting things about the Sustainable Development Goals was the idea of climate change having its own standalone goal. Some people just said they'd mainstream it, but what was very important is people felt it was the challenge of this century, so it had to have its own goal. So if you look at the MDGs, as was brought up by Eleanor, There were 8 Millennium Development Goals. For the Sustainable Development Goals, what they have now, the zero draft, there's actually 17 goals. So they expanded from 8 to 17. They're hoping it's not too big and unruly, but there was negotiation process was quite extensive. I was fortunate enough to be able to participate in the 3rd open working group, as well as the 11th and the 12th and the final one that actually just concluded last week, Saturday. It went all the way Friday evening, didn't finish like it was supposed to Friday afternoon, went until 4 in the morning. They then took a nap and came back at 7 a.m. to then conclude the negotiations for the open working group, and that'll be the final open working group. Since you're interested in that, we'll start with that. We'll start with the 17 different SDGs, as they're called. Of course, this isn't the end. There'll still be a couple of important inputs. One of them will be the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, will make his own report describing the SDGs that will also incorporate the work of the Eminent Persons panel that he worked with, as well as Jeffrey Sachs's process with the Sustainable Development Network. We'll show a brief video of some of the discussions that he's been having with the experts that he's working with. And then, of course, there's the Finance Committee that's also been meeting, and then there'll be, starting in September, an entire year of negotiations on the SDGs. But we're at least able to provide you here at the 15th Annual Summer Seminar with the latest one. So let me show you, if we can pull that up first. We will go to the computer, and let's work through this outcome document so you can at least look at them, and we'll, if I'm going through too fast, let me know, and we'll go slower. But here is the outcome document of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. And of course, there's the introduction. So of course, this all started with the Rio conference that took place in 1992. But the updated session was the Rio Plus 20. Rio Plus 20 was important. It came up with the document, The Future We Want. And one of the goals of that was to create an open working group to create sustainable development goals. The idea was that one of the most important ones was poverty eradication, was absolutely crucial because we want to free humanity from poverty and hunger as a matter of urgency. But then also pointing out that we couldn't do that without looking at sustainable patterns of consumption and production and protecting and managing our natural resource base. So this was important to be raised as well. Another important part there was looking at including all people in the process, the children of the world, youth and future generations, and to make sure all were included without distinction. And that was a very important part of this important open working group. They also talked about the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, because many different countries had done different things to put us in the situation that we're in today, but to point out we're all in this together. What's important about paragraph 6, if you look at that, is it's what the UN does at all their meetings. It kind of gives you a background to everything. So all of these different declarations and programs of actions set the stage for what we're going to do next with the Sustainable Development Goals. Starts out with the Rio Declaration, Agenda 21, the World Summit on Sustainable Development that took place in Johannesburg, the Small Island Developing States Conference that took place in Barbados. Of course, for many of us, it's important to note it'll take place next in Samoa early in the year. It also looked at the major UN conferences and summits in all fields, including the Millennium Declaration, the World Summit Outcome, the Monterey Consensus on International Financing and Development, and of course, the Beijing Declaration and Platform of Action focusing on women's rights. Number 7 is important because it talks about a couple of things that are absolutely essential and people said had to be the framework for the new important sustainable development goals, that it talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international instruments relating to human rights and international law, noting that it must include that. It included the reaffirmation of freedom, peace, and security, and respect for all rights, including the right to development, the right to an adequate standard of living, the right to food and water, the rule of law, good governance, gender equality, women's empowerment, and overall commitment to just and democratic societies. So there's some important language there, especially for countries that don't always respect human rights and don't see the connection between development and rights. Another important point was also looking at climate change, as we talked about earlier, based on UNA Hawaii's upcoming event in September. What it points out there is a couple of important points. It says, it noted with grave concern the significant gap between the aggregate effective mitigation pledges by parties in terms of global annual emissions of greenhouse gases by 2020 and aggregate emission pathways consistent with having a likely chance of holding the increase in the global average temperature below 2 or 1.5 C above pre-industrial levels. And that's the important point there, is that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, that's its main goal, but we had to at least include that here in this important sustainable development goals. And of course, a big point brought up by many Pacific Island states, or small island developing states as they're called, was to keep it at 1.5, because if it goes below that, it will hit a catastrophic level for small island states in Oceania, specifically Kiribati and Tuvalu. One side note before we go into paragraph 9 is that the Secretary General called for a climate summit to get governments to make their pledges to be able to mobilize support before the Peru meeting in Lima, where it's the last chance to negotiate before 2015, when they'll have the new Paris agreement that'll be binding on carbon emissions. So it's kind of an important time we're at. We really are at a year and a half out for a lot of exciting new things at the United Nations. Paragraph 9 says planet Earth and its ecosystems are our home, and actually takes into the Bolivian consideration of Mother Earth, as well as many indigenous people, as a very important space for us and our only home, and the necessity for us to live in harmony with nature. Number 10 talked about the most vulnerable countries, and in particular African countries, and to make sure we have special attention on their needs and interests. 11 talked about Rio Plus 20, focusing on sustainable development for all, focusing on social equity and protection of the environment, focusing as well on future generations, development of children to their full potential through education, as well as women's empowerment and equal employment for all. Number 12 was looking at the important issue of looking at development and talking about the mobilization of resources to make sure that people will be able to meet that. The Intergovernmental Committee of Experts on Sustainable Development Financing will be able to share their reports as well. That will be included in the final document. And then on 13, 14, and 15, some of the main things that they talked about there are looking at models and tools for each country to come up with their own national circumstances and priorities in the 3 areas of environment, economy, and social issues. Also, they talked about civil society, saying that it has to be an important part. And they talked about some of the new mechanisms. What was kind of exciting is they created a new high-level political forum. And the high-level political forum met for the second time. I was able to attend it last month. The high-level political forum will actually review every country and how they're implementing their sustainable development goals. So that's an important change. With the sustainable development goals, it's no longer just developing countries that will be reviewed. The exciting thing is that every country will be reviewed. So even the most developed countries, the ones with the highest GDP in the world, will also have their sustainable development goals reviewed. And the high-level political forum is looking at options. One of them is what we mentioned earlier, something similar to the Universal Periodic Review that exists now in the Human Rights Council. Paragraph 15 looked at the important issue to remove the obstacles to the full realization of the right of self-determination of peoples living under colonial and foreign occupation, knowing that that must be important to actually be able to be sustainable. And then they also looked at the one argument there, of course, was making sure that the territorial integrity and political independence of all states is respected. 17 looked at the importance of the SDGs, but an important issue there is disaggregated data, so that people would know exactly how people are doing in all of these new 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And the important thing too is they also have targets and indicators. And that's an important thing that they looked at here for the SDGs, so that countries can actually show how they're living up to that. So here are the actual top 17 Sustainable Development Goals, premiered for the first time in Hawaii. The first goal is to end poverty in all its forms everywhere. So you can see there they have a couple of targets underneath. By 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. What they actually said with that was that they hoped that they could end poverty forever by the end of 2013, because this is from 2015 to 2030. They also looked at social protection systems at a national level that would include floors. They also looked at making sure that there are equal rights to economic resources, such as control over land, property, inheritance, natural resources, appropriate new technology, financial services, most importantly including microfinance, pointing out the important work of Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. Then there's also a couple other points there of significant mobilization of resources from a variety of sources through enhanced development cooperation, and then creating sound policy frameworks at national, regional, and international levels based on pro-poor and gender-sensitive development strategies to support accelerated investments. So that's SDG 1. SDG 2 was to end hunger, achieve food security, and improve nutrition and promote sustainable agriculture. So that's important even here in Hawaii. We could look at that in many different ways. What they talked about there was ending hunger, ensuring access for all to safe, nutritious, and sufficient food, ending all forms of malnutrition, doubling the agricultural productivity and incomes of small-scale food producers. There, importantly, there's a reference to indigenous peoples in paragraphs 2.3. And then 2.4, implement resilient agricultural practices, important for adaptation to climate change. 2.5, looking at wild species and making sure that seeds are protected. And Hilo, if you want, I can send you this at the end of the talk as well, so you don't have to take as many notes and we could just talk. If that's better, I can see you nodding that way. And then, of course, the other aspects of looking at proper function of food commodity markets and their derivatives and facilitate timely access to information so that people could make sure that food price volatility doesn't continue. We saw that happen too often. But the point there is gene banks, and that's people being able to control their seeds. Number 3, ensuring healthy lives and promote well-being for all at all ages. Talking about the global maternity mortality rate to less than 70 per 100,000 live births. Ending preventable death of newborns and under 5. End the epidemic of AIDS, TB, malaria, and other waterborne diseases and communicable diseases. Reduce by 1/3 premature mortality from non-communicable diseases through prevention and treatment. And then, of course, looking at strengthening prevention and treatment for substance abuse, as well as harmful use of alcohol, having the global deaths and injuries from road traffic accidents, universal access to sexual and reproductive health care, achieving universal health coverage, and substantially reduce the number of deaths from hazardous chemicals and air, water, and soil pollution and contamination, strengthening implementation of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control in all countries, and looking at the other important issues related to health financing and strengthening the capacity of all countries for early warning, risk reduction, and management of national and global health risks. We'll go over one more, number 4, and then if anybody has a question about any of them. Number 4 is including and ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning. So that's something that what we consider the Advanced Summer Seminar would do is continuing lifelong learning, but that all girls and boys complete free, equitable, and quality primary and secondary education, leading to relevant and effective learning outcomes. All girls and boys have access to early childhood development, care, and pre-primary education, one of the important things that was happening here in Hawaii and mentioned in the campaign for governor. To ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable, quality, technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university, something that students are raising here, especially with the important increase in education and the difficulty of students to meet that. Also talking about relevant skills for employment, decent jobs, and entrepreneurship. Eliminate gender disparities is raised as well. And of course, looking at learners acquiring knowledge and skills need to promote sustainable development. We know we don't teach that enough, and that's one of the reasons, of course, why we have our summer seminar, but also to look at teaching sustainable development, sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. And then the last one is looking at supply of qualified teachers through international cooperation for teaching, training, in developing countries. And so that's our first 4. Any comments on the first 4 so far? Any questions?
Boy.
That's too much. We gotta study it.
It is a lot, but the good news is at least we're looking at now, and then I can admit during the MDGs, we were basically finding out about them, and governments were deciding, and then we were trying to figure out campaigns around the Millennium Development Goals. I remember when they first came out and learning them, and one of the important things, and one of the things we did here at Earth Day was actually, there's a website called World We Want, and what we've been doing is actually giving lectures and talks, and then having people going to the website and voting on their top 6 priorities. And we did that also at Earth Day here at UH Manoa, so that people could actually vote and see what their priorities are and then see how they look compared to the rest of the world. So I agree with you over there in Hilo. It is a lot. I could just go over the goal and not the targets, but I wanted to at least show you, because interesting is they debated and negotiated this, and I was able to be there for 3 one-week sessions in May, June, and July. They had the 11th, 12th, and 13th session of the Open Working Group, and they actually went through, if you could imagine this, in a new formula of troikas, of 3 different countries coming together and speaking as one. But they actually went through every language for every paragraph and every single number. So everything there is actually negotiated by all the governments. And many governments, of course, wouldn't want certain things, but they work to make sure it's included. And many groups, the major groups, just to give you an insight, the major groups, including indigenous peoples, youth and children, women, farmers, labor, they would actually have meetings with the co-chairs and then present language that they thought was best. And the co-chairs would actually give them credit and introduce it to states and ask states to look at it as well. But it was an intense negotiation throughout the entire time. So it definitely was a lot of work, and we're definitely not done. But the idea really of our advanced summer seminar to let everybody know enough about it beforehand. What we'll try to do throughout the year is make it more simplified so that everyone can learn the SDGs, and then we'll see, because there might even be some changes before they're finalized. The proposed goal number 5, then, we'll go through it to continue, is looking at achieving gender equality empowerment of all women and girls. That's important to look at the issue of trafficking and other forms of exploitation. Also eliminating all harmful practices such as early and forced marriage and female genital mutilations. Looking at unpaid care and domestic work. Looking at how that could be included into a national level to be able to respect that more. Ensuring women's full and effective participation in leadership at all levels of decision making. We still have a lot of work to do in this country as well. Looking at the Beijing Platform for Action on access to sexual reproductive health and reproductive rights, and undertaking reforms to give women equal rights to other forms of proper financial access to ownership, control over lands, and important issues there, as well as enabling technologies and enforceable legislation. Number 6 is quite important. Number 6 is ensuring availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all. So important thing there is looking at the universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water. Many people wanted to have it as the right to water, but some states wanted to organize against that. Matt Damon and other groups are working on the right to water, so it's gained a lot of prominence in the last decade, but still didn't get the right there. They also talked about implementing water resource management at all levels and protecting and restoring water-related ecosystems, rivers, aquifers, lakes, and wetlands. Also looking at international cooperation and capacity building support to develop countries in water and sanitation related activities and programs, including water harvesting, desalination, water efficiency, wastewater treatment, and reuse technology. And then also finally, local communities' participation for improving the water and sanitation management. Number 7 is ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. This is important because I actually even had a UN conference that Ban Ki-moon initiated called Sustainable Energy for All. And we were able to actually meet people there, such as the innovator from the Philippines, who was creating electricity through empty plastic water bottles, which we recycle here for 5 cents, and actually lighting up a village. He might be one of our speakers for the fall, and we're looking at coordinating his visit here to Hawaii. So we're looking at that. But at the Sustainable Energy for All, that really did have many innovative practices, such as one called Mama Light, from a woman from Africa working with a Dutch company that then could provide light for children to study for up to 8 years is how long the light lasts, for only $30. So it's looking at how $30 could actually make the difference in a young child's life to be able to study every evening, which wasn't possible before then. So this example of ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all was quite important. It's looking at the global energy mix, having much more renewable energy, which is absolutely crucial, and then looking at sustainable energy services in all developing countries, and that was brought up there. Number 8 was promoting sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work for all. So it's actually looking at that important issue of people being able to have employment where they're respected and be able to gain equity by being able to have resources based on the important work that they do. It's an important right in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And also to make sure that there was full and productive employment and decent work for all women and men, including for young people and persons with disabilities, and equal pay for work of equal value. And very important one, especially as we're getting into August. August 26th, of course, is our Equal Pay for Equal Work Day in the United States. Here's one that is important for us on 8.9. It says to actually devise and implement policies, promote sustainable tourism, which creates jobs, promotes local culture and products. That would be important for us to look at how we're doing development and tourism here in Hawaii, and of course come up with alternative models that then the state should get behind, as well as the country, to actually be able to make sure we meet up with that number of Sustainable Development Goal number 8 and that target. Number 9 is building resilient infrastructure, promoting inclusive and sustainable industrialization, and foster innovation. So for some people this was controversial because industrialization seemed to get us to the problem that we have today. But then also for least developed countries, they said they very much wanted small scale, as pointed out there in 9.3, and sustainable and inclusive industrialization, where they're able to then make sure that everyone's rights are respected and that they actually do it in harmony with nature and not at the peril of our planet. So they talked about upgrading technological capacities to facilitate sustainable and resilient infrastructure in developing countries, and to make sure that there's access and striving for universal and affordable technology for all. And then, of course, that gets to the important point of proposed goal number 10. And then we'll stop there for a little while. But reducing inequality within and among countries. So that's an important point, that in today's world, we could have the richest people that fit on a bus having as much as the bottom half. That's a stunning statistic when you look at how much wealth is in such a small number of hands. So they're trying to look at reducing inequality within and among countries. We see that as well here in Hawaii as well as in the United States. The gap between the wealthy and those who are striving to get out of poverty. So they're talking about ensuring equal opportunity and reducing inequalities. They talk about adopting policies, especially fiscal, wage, and social protection policies, to progressively achieve greater equality. That's important. This summer, Seattle passed the highest minimum wage, over $15. So that's exciting to see different examples of what people are doing there. And the other aspect they talk about there is improving regulation and monitoring of global financial markets and institutions and strengthen implementation of such regulation. So that's to make sure we don't have what happened in 2008 with the global financial crisis caused by the actions here in the United States. So that's up to number 10. We have 7 more to go. But I wanted to allow anyone, if they had any comments or questions regarding 1 through 10. You're okay, Letitia, on West Oahu?
Yes, I am. That this is a lot to take in. But
When can we get a copy of this? When can we read this? It's not on
Yeah,
TV, not on.
Yeah, it's not available around the world. I will send it to you concluding our talk today. How's that?
Good.
And then
send
what
it
we
to
can
us.
look at doing is maybe in September, October, November, we can have a Sustainable Development Goal event at Hilo, and I could come over and we could work on something and share some of these aspects and what the SDGs would mean for Hilo and for Hawaii. I don't know if that sounds like a good idea.
Good idea.
In fact, one of the things we might be applying for is they will have Sustainable Development Goal consultations very soon. And United Nations Association, we could apply for one of those. And maybe we can try to make sure we have it on a couple of islands. If that sounds good. All right. So some good ideas coming from our summer seminar on how we can work together. Number 11 is making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable. That's important there to look at cities, but more importantly, our housing, and looking at safe and affordable housing is quite crucial there. The other thing that we looked at there is Sustainable Development Goal number 12, ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. That's important there because they look at the important issues that most people aren't aware of. They talked about having the per capita global food waste at the retail and consumer level and reducing food loss along production and supply chains, including post-harvest loss, which is quite crucial. They also looked at substantially reducing waste generation through prevention, reduction, recycling, and reusing. They encourage companies, especially large and transnational, to adopt sustainable practices and integrate sustainable information into their reporting cycle. They also looked at having relevant information and awareness for sustainable development in harmony with nature. And then, of course, the last couple points there are looking at to rationalize inefficient fossil fuel subsidies that encourage wasteful consumption by removing market distortions in accordance with national circumstances, including restructuring taxation and phasing out those harmful subsidies where they exist to reflect their environmental impacts, taking fully into account the specific needs and conditions of developing countries and minimizing the possible adverse impacts on their development in a manner that protects the poor and affected communities. That's huge because that's actually going after the fossil fuel industry that gets huge subsidies. So that was kind of important. Number 13 was taking urgent action, and this is actually the important one for most of us here. Climate change is SDG 13, taking urgent action to combat climate change and its impact, strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity to climate-related hazards and natural disasters in all countries, improving education, awareness raising, and human and institutional capacity on climate change mitigation, adaptation, impact reduction, and early warnings. And number 14 is looking at conserving and sustainably using the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development. This is being, of course, shared by Hokulea. Of course, it went here from Oahu over to Hawaii Island and is going around the world to actually talk about this important issue. So Hokulea is kind of doing this role, realizing proposed goal number 13 and 14 in its work. But the main thing there is actually looking at regulating harvesting and ending overfishing and making sure that the destructive fishing practices are ceased. Looking at the important things of what's going on to include indigenous technology and, as they point out here, access to small-scale artisanal fishers to marine resources and markets. Number 15 is to protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainable manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and halt biodiversity loss. Very important there to look at all the other systems that need to be protected as we look at sustainability in the future. It even looks at ending poaching and trafficking of species and looking at understanding and preventing the introduction and significantly reduce the impact of invasive alien species, as well as enhancing global support to combat the trafficking of protected species. Number 16, so only two more to go. 16 is exciting. 16 talks about promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Many governments didn't want this. They kind of considered this, in a way, imposing a certain order on them. But it's very important that people fighting for basic freedoms, democracy, and human rights said that you had to have a culture of peace and a rule of law as a global goal, because you couldn't have sustainability and sustainable development if that wasn't in existence. So proposed goal 16 was very crucial, looking at reducing all forms of violence, to look at end abusing, exploitation, trafficking, and all forms of violence and torture against children. Promoting the rule of law, 16.3 is quite significant. To substantially reduce corruption and bribery, to develop effective accountability and transparent institutions at all levels, and ensuring responsive, inclusive, participatory, and representative decision-making at all levels. One of the other things they talked about there was legal identity for all people, because many people don't have birth registration that then prevents them from being able to participate. National institutions, such as national human rights institutions based on the Paris Principles, was also important. And then non-discriminatory laws and policies. And finally, number 17 looks a lot like number 8 of the Millennium Development Goals, except stronger. Strengthening the means of implementation and revitalize the global partnership for sustainable development finance. Quite important there. Looking at some of the age-old things, which we've talked about forever, the 0.7%, that's supposed to be assistance that the developed countries are supposed to give to developing countries, but we all know is a lot lower. So moving that up. Also to mobilize additional financial resource for developing countries from multiple sources. Looking at technology, enhancing north-south and south-south cooperation. Also looking at transferring dissemination diffusion of environmentally sound technologies to developing countries so that they could leapfrog. Examples of that would be cell phones. Instead of them having to put landlines in, they can just go straight to cell phones and using those instead of digging up their earth. Capacity building was important, as well as trade. And then, of course, the final aspect there is policy institutional coherence and multi-stakeholder partnership. Focusing on enhancing global partnerships so that all people could work together and having effective public, private, civil society partnerships so we could actually work together with other countries around the world. So I do agree that was a lot to cover, definitely to look at, but it's kind of important to be able to have that there. The one thing I wanted to pull up next would be this short film by Jeffrey Sachs. We'll just watch a couple minutes of it, but it's important because Jeffrey Sachs and Columbia University, they're mobilizing on sustainable development goals and they're even having degrees, masters and doctorates looking at SDGs. So we'll just show a brief part of that, and then we'll get back to the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples and the Permanent Forum.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome everybody here this evening for the university lecture, and I think everybody here knows the context in which we have these lectures twice a year, and they date back to the 1970s. The purpose is to try to hear our most distinguished and creative faculty, and we certainly have that to look forward to tonight. Just a few words, personal words, introducing Jeff. I first met Jeff's parents. I mean, that makes me sound old. I'm not that old, actually, but I happened to know them because I was in Michigan, and Jeff's father was one of the leading, he was the leading labor lawyer in the state of Michigan, one of the finest in the country. And his wife and Jeff's mother, wonderful, wonderful person, and I would meet them periodically, and they would talk about Jeff, and I was not as impressed as they were, but I was very impressed, and I loved the looks in their eyes as they talked about Jeff and what he was doing, and of course it was incredibly important, incredibly engaged in the issues of the time. I then came to Columbia in 2001, 2002, and one of the first things I was involved with was recruiting Jeff to come here to Columbia. And that was a pleasure. And then we traveled together, and Jane and Sonia and I spent time in Bangladesh and in Africa and India and other places, and I really was able to see Jeff's work firsthand. And of course, enjoying and learning from Sonia was also part of that process, a physician in her own right and a great partner, substantively as well as personally. Jeff took over the Earth Institute and really made the Earth Institute. Underneath this term, the Earth Institute, are these stunning parts of the university, and I'm thinking in particular of Lamont Doherty and the great work that has happened there over the decades on study of the oceans and the Earth. And Jeff brought to that, and the Mailman School of Public Health and other parts of the university, SEAS and elsewhere, a kind of galvanizing force that he is almost uniquely capable of bringing. And was able to marry the work being done on technology and science and earth sciences and health, medicine, with policy and with implementation. And that's been a really wonderful, wonderful part of this university and a wonderful thing for the world. Jeff, more broadly, is impossible to capture in a paragraph or two. The world, of course, is incredibly complicated and seems to get more complicated by the decade. Certainly, if you look over the course of your life, I mean, you see a couple of billion people having access to human knowledge, awareness. You see the revolutions that causes. You see governments trying to respond to that, sometimes repressively, sometimes helplessly, because they're really not capable and equipped to do that. And then religion begins to fill voids, and that can be good and it can be bad and dangerous. And you see all of this playing out in a world in which we really have to figure out very, very big and important issues. And Jeff is part of that, and he has made us conscious of this, made us more and more aware of it. But there's one thing that I think is Jeff's legacy that I want to emphasize, and that is that there are millions and millions of people who live on the edge of life and who live under extraordinary conditions, adverse conditions, who perish as a result of this, who suffer as a result of this. And it's very easy, in fact, the kind of customs of the world to ignore the sense of conformity that we live in, all of us. And it's Jeff who constantly says the world need not be that way. And in so many ways, from his scholarship to his policymaking to his personal appeals to his own work, forever is saying to us and to the world, things really can be different. There are some people, George Orwell, I remember some point in my life reading all of George Orwell, and it was one powerful moment when the question was asked of him, what will it take to eliminate poverty? And I think he said, if I remember correctly, it's just when people want to end poverty. And Jeff Sachs is sort of our George Orwell of the time, and that is an enormous credit to him and a great good fortune for Columbia. John?
So that is just a brief introduction to the work of Jeffrey Sachs. Jeffrey Sachs, of course, did a lot of work with the Millennium Development Goals. That was quite important. He did set up, you could see on the side of the Earth Institute, they had Millennium Villages, where they actually would try to implement the MDGs in specific villages and change the conditions. And I think one of the most important points, of course, for Jeffrey Sachs is he's always looking at the people on the edges and ensuring that the people don't perish who are living in poverty and focusing on the way forward. So that's quite crucial. And of course, as we look at one of the most important issues around the world, it's definitely indigenous peoples. So here is a small example just to look at. This is the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. This was probably the other major topic that came up this summer that's still taking place. This is the website that was created. But the UN World Conference on Indigenous Peoples was actually initiated by the government of Bolivia a couple of years ago. They said that there should be a high-level plenary meeting of the General Assembly that addressed indigenous peoples. Unfortunately, there was not a lot of action on this important World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, which is slated to take place September 22nd and 23rd of this year. The point that connects with what Letitia had discussed and was interested in knowing about, Letitia asked what happened at the Permanent Forum. One of the most important things people thought would have happened at the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues this year was actually a start to the negotiations on the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples and the creation of the Zero Draft. The Zero Draft is just UN terms for the basic language for negotiation at the UN that countries negotiate along with civil society, and in this case, of course, indigenous peoples and nations. This process began in really June. It should have happened in May. Many people thought it would happen on the last day of the Permanent Forum. The topic of the Permanent Forum was looking at the right of self-determination, looking at autonomy, looking at Articles 3 to 6 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That was going to be the main thing. But in many ways, it didn't happen. What did happen, on the other hand, was nothing took place and everyone left, unfortunately, without the President of the General Assembly actually creating a roadmap. He promised a roadmap, but there were no dates, and many people weren't sure if it would happen. In fact, some people called for a cancellation. Other people requested a postponement. One of the other factors is Uganda will be president of the General Assembly during this World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. Many people were concerned because Africa is taking a rather conservative position of indigenous peoples. So there was idea of maybe a postponement till it would go to another region, potentially Denmark the year afterwards. But on June 3rd was the first meeting was called. We were able to actually attend that meeting. Then they announced June 17th through 18th would take place. So that was important because that's when Indigenous peoples were able to state what they thought would be important. And most of it really came from this World Conference. I'll just show you some of the different aspects of the World Conference. They have places where people can share their messages and photos. They also have important video galleries giving updated information and what people can do. So it's kind of important to look at, and it's exciting to see what has happened. Before this Alta meeting that took place last summer, there were regional meetings in all 7 regions of the world. The Pacific one was held in March with Les Melzer here in Australia. Then they met in June of last year in Alta. It's important to talk about Alta because from Alta is where they came up with the main document for Indigenous peoples around the world that they wanted to be the foundation of the negotiations. So that's been taking place in a good way and moving forward. What I'll do is show you what was the result of 2 negotiations. The first meeting was the 17th and 18th. From that meeting, they actually had many Indigenous peoples from all the regions come together. They shared their positions. From their positions, and also based on what government said, they came up with a 0 draft. And then just on July 16th was the second round of consultations. And then they just announced today, August 18th and 19th will be the final round of negotiations. And that final round of negotiations will take place during that time period on the 18th and 19th. And then the 0 draft document, which I'll show you, will be amended. And then that will be the foundation for the actual adoption at the UN. So just going to show you and share with you here the 0 draft and what existed. This is what they came up with so far. Of course, this will change, but this is the language that exists. There are actually 39 paragraphs. We won't go through them as long as we did on the SDGs. The SDG goals were a little bit more significant. These might change. But what's important is that there's a couple of new ideas that did come out. Some of the ideas are tools to implement the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, a potential optional protocol that would be established, and even an enhancement of the expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples, the MRIP, to be able to actually review cases of how the Declaration is being implemented. Also, the idea of Indigenous nations, such as the Navajo Nation and other Indigenous peoples, to be able to participate as observer nations. So that would be new. And the other aspect is that Indigenous peoples would even have an Undersecretary General right underneath Kofi Annan that would have a position of actually making sure that Indigenous peoples' rights is mainstream throughout the UN. So that's kind of important there. We'll go through some of the articles. First one was looking at the advancement of Indigenous peoples under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and they recognize it as the minimum standard, which is quite important for Indigenous peoples. Looking also at the major achievements of the Permanent Forum. That's important. The creation of the Permanent Forum was significant. The expert mechanism on the rights of Indigenous peoples is significant. And also the creation of the Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples to make sure those work. And then, of course, non-discrimination, that Indigenous peoples are not discriminated against in any way. Paragraph 4 looks at actions directly at translating the UN Declaration into national law, including how to include the judiciary, parliament members, elected officers, educators, and civil service, harmonizing national constitutions and legislation, to recognize the rights of indigenous peoples, as in the UN Declaration. Also ratification of ILO Convention 169 on indigenous peoples. ILO Convention 169 is important because it's the oldest UN agency, dating back to 1919, and has looked at indigenous peoples since the 1920s, when it looked at exploitative practices in silver mines in Latin and South America. An important thing here is calling for national action plans to be developed under number 7. Number 8, that their justice mechanisms can be included in dispute resolution and harmonious relationships between indigenous and with the countries they find themselves in, as well as making sure it aligns with international standards. Committing to coordination and dialogue with indigenous peoples' justice institutions, and to include that for justice awareness campaigns. Empower indigenous peoples to more effectively address the forms of violence against indigenous women, youth, and children, particularly looking at sexual and domestic violence, trafficking, and violence related to extractive industries. This was brought up by the Special Rapporteur, Jim Anaya, in many of his reports, as well as at the recent Forum on Business and Human Rights. The commit to work with free, prior, informed consent of indigenous peoples, which is absolutely crucial there, and looking at disaggregated data, which is also brought up under the SDGs. Looking at the issue of public policy. Develop fair, transparent, effective mechanisms with indigenous people for repatriation of ceremonial objects and remains. To request that the Human Rights Council improves the implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Number 14 talks about encouraging treaty bodies. So we talked briefly about treaty bodies in the beginning of today. The U.S. has only ratified 3. The ICCPR on civil and political rights, the CERD on racial discrimination, and the CAT on torture. And this is important that they would ask the declaration be included in the deliberation of all those instruments, as well as the other 7 that exist. The UN to have national and regional consultations with the UN Development Group guidelines for indigenous peoples. To recall the General Assembly resolution on national institutions, talking about the Paris Principles, to have national human rights institutions that recognize indigenous people. And then here's an important point. Request the Secretary General with support of the UN Interagency Support Group for Indigenous Issues and with indigenous peoples, member states, to develop a system-wide action plan on the following issues: eradicating poverty, violence against indigenous women, communication, health and education, occupation and livelihoods, data disaggregation, establishment of national level interagency support groups, indigenous persons with disability, good governance and access to justice, strengthening human rights protection mechanisms. And this is where they call the appointment of a high representative for indigenous peoples to be appointed by the Secretary General. Also, even the idea of creating a new special rapporteur on violence against women, focusing on indigenous women and children. Then they also looked at promoting indigenous participation, and that's the one there about indigenous, right here, the participation of indigenous peoples' governments at the UN. Then, of course, the other aspect is looking at a human development report of UNDP that would actually look at indigenous peoples and include them. This is important because in many places, indigenous peoples aren't included because, such as the United States and Canada, development really looks at developing countries and doesn't look at the other countries. So that's quite important there. The other point that's brought up there is to look at the idea of recognizing indigenous peoples' laws and traditions and customs and land tenure systems. The important point here is free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples to be included there, as well as traditional subsistence activities and food security. Consultation mechanisms with human rights standards for free, prior, and informed consent regarding land. Committing to examine and cooperate with indigenous peoples on important issues of international law, still with free, prior, and informed consent. And in 26 is affirming and recognize the right to protection, preservation, and restitution of sacred places, sites, and cultural landscapes. So all of these very important to Hawaii. Last one, 27, is to commit to promote the development of review mechanisms and protocols to ensure that the private sector upholds principles of good governance. That, of course, is looking here at businesses and making sure that businesses are also part of that. Going back to 28, due consideration to indigenous peoples in the post-2015 development agenda, which we just went over thoroughly, so we don't have to go through that or wonder what that is under 28. And then if you're going down here to 29, the main point there is recognizing the experience of indigenous peoples and how that, of course, can be helpful when looking at the post-2015. In fact, in many ways, if you're trying to be sustainable, to not include indigenous models would really miss the point, because they have one of the only examples of living sustainably for millennia. Then recognizing indigenous peoples' traditional knowledge and strategies, as well as manifestation of their sciences and cultures, and maintaining resilience would be important here, especially for climate change prevention, adaptation, and mitigation. Then they talked about full, effective, equal participation of indigenous peoples in education, health, and well-being. Reaffirming the indigenous youth to focus on future generations. Number 33 is important, especially for people in Hilo, with Paukaloa maybe, and other issues here with Makua on Oahu. Urging member states to cease militarization of lands, territories, waters, and oceans of indigenous peoples and initiate processes to demilitarize these areas. Kind of important there. Other areas, it's more important where indigenous are dragged into the conflict, to making sure that they're not pulled into the armed conflicts that take place around the world. Then they called on paragraph 34 for a third decade. 35 asked for the third decade to be worked with the high representative that was being proposed. 36 was asking states to contribute to the UN Voluntary Fund. 37 was requesting the Secretary General to talk about progress and an outcome and to share that in 2015. 38 was requesting the General Assembly to include a specific focus on indigenous peoples in its final report on the MDGs, which we talked about, the Millennium Development Goals, and then asking for Secretary General to report to the 70th session on the progress towards implementation of this document. So that there is something that I know Letitia at West Oahu was interested in, was knowing how that was going and what was going on. So this is the draft resolution as it is now. It will be reviewed again. Of course, it's not complete. It will look at maybe one more time being reviewed and changed. So that's that. Those are some of the aspects. Any questions, Letitia or Hilo, about the different instrument? What will happen is on the 17th and 18th the 18th and 19th of August, there'll be 2 more days of negotiation. What people will do is actually make points to actually change that, and then that will be the final aspect. Then from the 18th and 19th of August, there'll be 1 month till the 22nd, 23rd, and the goal is hopefully that the states and indigenous peoples will come to an agreement, and there'll be a document that will look like this one that will be adopted on the 23rd of September. As it is right now, there's 2 governments and 2 indigenous peoples that are chairing this process to advise the President of the General Assembly. Les Mauser from Australia, from the Gabi Gabi people, as well as Myrna Cunningham, a physician from Central America. They are the indigenous representatives. They are helping to draft the final document with the governments of Liberia and Slovenia. So those 4 are in charge of this final document. And at the second consultation that just happened on July 16th, many governments were negotiating from a very strong state position. And we'll see what happens in the next phase. That'll just happen next month. We'll try to give an update and our 7th session, our 7th season of our Human Rights Sustainability Campus Community Dialogues. But that's just an update from that. I hope that's helpful for everyone there. And that's that. We'll now go to just maybe talking a little bit about or answering any questions. Any questions, Letitia, about the first part there of the World Conference and the Permanent Forum? Go ahead.
Ready for the women, a rapporteur for the women to help the women. I like that part, that was in the goals.
Okay. Yes, that was brought up that since Indigenous women have a chance of facing violence at such a higher alarming rate than everyday women in society, that they would definitely have a mechanism to be able to address that. So one of the ideas was a new special rapporteur. What's important is some governments say, well, we shouldn't create more costs. What's important is we already have a special rapporteur on Indigenous people, so maybe just the mandate of the special rapporteur could make sure that it includes violence against women and children. The United States is promoting this idea of a rapporteur or the process. Vicky Talley-Corpus was just named the new special rapporteur. She's the third person holding the position of special rapporteur on Indigenous peoples. Rudolfo Stavenhagen was the first one, and James Anaya was the second one. And so Vicky Talley-Corpus from Tebteba in the Philippines, she's the third one. And she did say in her mandate she would look at Indigenous women. So the idea is, do we need to create a new post or look at the other rapporteurs that focus on violence against women and the special rapporteur on the rights of Indigenous people and maybe bring them together? So these are some of the things that that we could look at or talk about. So that's what we're kind of going with from there.
Thank you.
No problem.
Joshua, what
Yes.
kinds of things did you say were discussed at that meeting that you went to at the United Nations?
What was that?
What kinds of things did you say were being discussed at that UNA meeting that you went to? Or you could
Good
email
point.
me. You could email me if you want
I think
to.
no.
Yeah.
I think it's absolutely important. So the UNA USA does meet in Washington D.C. every year in the summer. So it was important to go to that. So I was actually there, and we did an event focusing on what we'll talk about a lot in the next year, the Universal Periodic Review. So what we did was we had a Universal Periodic Review consultation where the U.S. State Department showed up and made a statement, and then we broke into 4 different groups looking at important issues in the United States, and then had UNA USA members actually coming up with the initial drafts of a UPR stakeholder report. So that's important because one of the things that we're looking at is before May of 2015, the United States will have its human rights record reviewed in this Universal Periodic Review. So what we could do throughout Hawaii is actually have Universal Periodic Review consultations about human rights in our society, and definitely at the community level, and then filter those up through the country level and to the global mechanism at the review in 2015. So we actually did an example of one of those on the evening of the second day. And then what happened is then other chapters thought they were good ideas, and then we started to do them around the country. As it is right now, we've had them on different campuses. We've had them at Georgetown University. We've had them at Harvard University. We've had them in community at chapter divisions in Chicago, as well as in San Francisco and in New York. So they're starting to happen around the country, so we could easily host one of those since I do those in the other places. There's no reason why we shouldn't have a UPR consultation here. Another thing that came out of that meeting in Washington, D.C. was they did a first round of Sustainable Development Goal consultations. So one of the exciting things is the UNA USA president said that we should definitely apply to host one of those Sustainable Development Goal consultations in the second round. And we've already, in a way, started that because we've already looked at the 17 SDGs, but allow us to have a conversation in the islands about what's important to us and how those 17 SDGs would impact and change the direction of how our economy, ecology, and the issues of social equity and equality are actually look like. So it's kind of exciting, and those were some of the things that came up. The other thing is people also did, they went on the Hill and then focused on specific issues that they thought was important for the United States to care about.
In 5 minutes.
So that was also brought up and raised there. So those were the main things that came up at the UNA USA meeting that I wanted to share with you, so you'd have information about that and things that we can do in the throughout the next year to actually grow the UNA movements here in Hawaii. Okay, so looks like we're getting ready to wrap up. One thing I did want to share, though, was the business and human rights. Business and human rights, kind of important. Business and human rights will actually have a brand new mechanism building on the guiding principles. That was the forum, as well as the working group that visits different countries. There's actually going to be a working group of governments, and it was actually spearheaded by Ecuador and South Africa, to have a binding treaty on businesses and human rights. So it will take some time, but they're actually looking at a treaty, which then, of course, would have a mechanism to report on human rights. And that's important because if you're looking at what business and human rights is focusing on, it's that there's protection, looking at the important things of what states would do, that businesses, of course, have a responsibility, and that people who are impacted have, of course, a remedy. So it's looking at states protecting, businesses really respecting human rights, and that people impacted have a remedy. And these are the three elements of this business and human rights guiding principles that we'll be able to look at for a while in the future, because it'll definitely come up more and more. So I know we only have 2 minutes left, but if there's any final points. The other thing that does come up is the U.S. review. So they'll be at the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination in August. We'll share some insights on that. And then the Committee Against Torture in November. But around September is when we turn in stakeholder reports. So we'll talk about that as well. So there's a lot to share, and it's definitely been an exciting summer at the United Nations. I'm glad we're able to share with you on this 15th annual Advanced Summer Seminar on human rights, to be able to talk about the important issues of peace, environment, human rights, and global justice. So I want to thank everyone for that. And we'll look forward to seeing everyone in September. And let's start sending emails around. I know we already have a couple of speakers. We'll have an Indigenous woman from Ryukyu from Okinawa. And we'll also have one of the founders of Indigenous Peoples Documentation Center from Geneva, and potentially the speaker from the Philippines on renewable energy. So we do have an exciting remaining part of 2014, and look forward to visiting Hilo and working together with all the neighbor islands to make sure that we can promote a culture of peace and rule of law here in Hawaii. So I guess we'll talk to everyone later. What we're going to do today is we'll actually have our final event at the ING Cafe. It'll be closing today. It was a good public space to meet at. We used to bring home all the information from the Rio Plus 20 Summit, as well as the new working group on business and human rights and the forum there. So the ING Now Capital Cafe will close down, so we'll have to find a new public space to be able to share information. But I want to thank everyone for coming today, and I'll try to send out information on dates in September, so anyone let me know dates they'd have. And mahalo, and I'll see everyone later.